I hope that everybody is safe and warm and not a victim of the latest round of bad weather that's been going across the country. And welcome to this afternoon's seminar. Just a few words about me in case you've not heard of me or don't know of my work in the area. I am a former university professor, but started my career as a teacher. I am a past president of the Council for Exceptional Children. I managed to keep up with college textbooks on topics related to co-teaching, inclusive practices, and collaboration, as well as intro to special education. And you may know that I spend much of my time now working in the area of co-teaching, working with school districts. It was interesting to hear the poll of where you're from in terms of grade levels that are represented. You should know that I don't come with a grade level. I sit in furniture so close to the ground, I don't know if my knees will get me up out of it. I also deal with a lot with high school. And today what you'll find as we go through this material is that I've tried to put examples across grade levels. I hear a lot from high school folks that they get concerned when there are no examples that pertain to them, and I really will try to do that. I'm in classrooms a lot, usually 250, maybe more classrooms per year. And what I try to do is help people figure out how to make co-teaching effective. And of course, that pertains directly to our topic today, especially designed instruction. Maybe because of the time of day for many of you, what you really want to know is, can you stand to listen to a woman on a webinar for about an hour or so? I sincerely hope so. Those of you who are in groups, you can also self-entertain. And one thing I dislike about webinars is that I can't say hello to everybody personally. So I'll do a little Garfield wave, hope that that's enough to get us started, and at least send us on our way. So here's what we're doing today. There are learning outcomes. What I'm really hoping is that we'll look at specially designed instruction and make sure that everybody's clear on it. If you know me, if you've been at one of the webinars or other activities, workshops that I've done, I apologize, but we really need to be sure that everybody is clear. We need to look at examples of SDI and be sure that everybody is clear on how we integrate those into instruction. Definitely look at documentation, probably not as much time on that as I'd like, but we'll at least address it and deal with, hopefully, questions that you have. I'm really much happier if people will interject questions, and Megan will read those so that everybody hears them, because any topic is better addressed if the audience is actively participating. So at this point, what I really hope you'll do is put your thinking cap on, because we've got to do a lot of exploring in a very short amount of time. And let's get on with the primary focus of today's webinar, which is the mistakes we're making with SDI. Mistake number one. I think, unfortunately, we sometimes are unclear in our deep understanding of SDI and in our ability to explain it to others. Now, it sounds like we have a lot of administrators in our webinar this afternoon, and for you, I really hope you think about this. There's nothing more disheartening than having a special educator come up during a workshop and kind of whisper, I don't really know what that SDI is that you're talking about. I suspect a couple of things. First is that I think some special educators know more than they give themselves credit for, but they're not used to articulating their specific roles in a general ed classroom. I think that sometimes we have special educators who are at a disadvantage. Perhaps they were prepared in a program that got caught in the No Child Left Behind emphasis on general education, and they didn't get the amount of training as some other people might have. Perhaps another dilemma for some of them is that they've almost hidden some of their SDI knowledge because of the emphasis on the general curriculum. I guess my point as I start on this mistake is not to sound or be critical of special educators, but to say that we need to be sure that we help all special educators and teachers, this is especially for you, that everybody be able to explain it, to distinguish it from other terms, and then to be able to share it with other people. Now, as we start, you'll see this slide more than one time, and this is kind of a big picture of co-teaching. all of us want effective co-teaching. What I've learned in working with schools for 30 plus years, I won't say how much more than 30, is that we've got to work on the professional role part. The two professionals in the classroom have to negotiate an understanding that each of them has a unique job to do. Each has different responsibilities, and the goal of this is not for them to become so blended that they forget about those distinctions. I don't find that that's necessarily difficult to talk about. Where it becomes hard is in the classroom, because as we head toward looking at what special educators do in the classroom, sometimes general ed teachers are caught by surprise. Unfortunately, this afternoon, we won't spend a huge amount of time in that particular circle, or square, I guess. The second part of this are the co-teaching approaches. We'll mention them this evening, but not as a focus. The issue is that's usually the second piece that has to be put in place, because if teachers don't know how to do the 6 approaches, they can't do this third part, which is the instructional part. And of course, this afternoon, we're on the instructional part, and we have to be absolutely certain that everybody knows how to put that piece in place. I hope that graphic helps a little bit. You'll notice it says supportive context down here. Get that supportive context highlighted. Everybody knows this has to have strong administrative support. That's at the district level. It's also at the site level. And this is a topic where it simply doesn't work for there to be verbal support without very meaningful support, problem solving, making sure that everybody's clear, coaching for the teachers. It's necessary if we're going to make co-teaching effective. Now, got to do the words first. This is one of my favorite quotes when we're talking about anything related to co-teaching and what goes on. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, it means what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. And I'll tell you that a first question I would ask everybody is this: how sure are you that everybody really understands what it is that's occurring in a co-taught class? I find sometimes people are using the term co-teaching and distinguishing from push-in, distinguishing from inclusion, all kinds of other words, just about the concept. We can't go down that path, but we should take a look at some of the words that co-teaching is not for. By the way, if you were children, I would never do the not fors first, but you're adult learners, so I figure you can hang on, because then once I get to where we want to be for the rest of the webinar, we won't go back to these. The first piece is that co-teaching is certainly not for help for students. While certainly they get help, I find it so insulting for those of you who are special ed teachers that people are just thrilled that you're the help. Seems to me like you're a little overqualified and a little overpaid to just be offering general assistance to anybody in the classroom. That's important to keep in mind, because in some ways help is the easiest role and people fall into it. Sometimes they fall into it because of a lack of planning time, sometimes because it lets general ed teachers do what they're used to doing and special ed teachers do what they're used to doing. But is it really why we want to have 2 teachers in a classroom? Co-teaching is not for the middle term in particular, differentiation, universal design for learning over here, and, okay, moment of pause. Do you know what that stands for? If you didn't guess, it's just good teaching. Sometimes we'll kind of get this belief, I'll be talking to co-teachers and they'll say, oh, Marilyn, look, we used visuals in our lesson. And I'm trying to be polite, and yet part of me is saying, well, kind of woohoo. Every good teacher uses visuals in their lesson. Sometimes people will talk about how the students all had, some kind of story starter, or that they provided some kind of cues on the board for everybody in the class. Those are great. Everyone should do those things. But that doesn't make it an effective co-taught class, because the whole notion of differentiation is something that every single teacher does in contemporary schools. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient to justify two professionals in a classroom. Next one up. Certainly, co-teaching is not for the delivery of accommodations. Now, teachers, before you panic, if you're in the classroom, of course, you're going to assist in accommodations. You would never turn your back and say, oh, I don't do accommodations. But if all a student needs is accommodations, that's really a general education responsibility. And I would expect that general educators would do that, and there wouldn't be a need for a co-teacher, a special educator in the classroom. We have to be very careful. People will working very hard. It's not about people not trying to do their best. They'll say, oh, I make sure the kid has a word bank. I make sure the kid has a graphic organizer. I make sure the kid is using the vocabulary words. I help and help and help. I make sure the accommodations from the IEP are there for the kid. But the dilemma is accommodations are tools that students get, and general ed teachers are primarily responsible for those in a general ed setting. We don't bring special educators in for that purpose. Modifications, I'll just mention very, very briefly. All of you know that modifications are really for students who have very significant needs. And usually we would say modifications would be something a special educator would do in another context. It's possible that would go on in a co-taught class, but because they're really for kids with very, very significant needs, in many co-taught classes that are primarily about students with learning disabilities, other health impairments, maybe speech language impairments, kids on the autism spectrum, many times modifications are really not even on the table for co-teachers. So I'll just let that one sit there for this evening. Now, that's what we don't do. Now we have to go to Special Ed 101 and just do a brief mention of what it involves and how that pertains to specially designed instruction. First, hopefully everybody knows this, but just as a little friendly reminder, special education is defined as being specially designed instruction. I can't tell you how important that is. If you think about it, just step back for a minute. If we put a special educator into a general ed classroom so that there are two teachers there, special educators are the professionals who are responsible for the delivery of SDI. And so if they're there, by definition, that is their purpose and that is the reason they are present. Now, in a minute, I'm going to talk a little bit more about exactly what SDI is, but this is the starting point to understand that SDI is the whole reason that a special educator is employed. Well, I guess some compliance work too, but it is their job to deliver the students' instruction based on their needs. Second part, this is just for completeness this afternoon. Certainly, related services are the second component of special ed. We're not going there. If there are related services professionals in the audience this afternoon, I apologize. We can't do everything in one day. And then the third part is supplementary aids and services. Now, here's why it's important to point this one out. Accommodations and modifications are discussed, addressed, outlined in this third element of the law. And so kids who are getting accommodations, that's great. They're entitled to them. They have to get them. But notice it's not the same as their specially designed instruction. It's an accompaniment to that. What we have to realize is that the only part of all of this that's required for every single student with an IEP is the first one. It's the specially designed instruction. Students can have an IEP and not get related services. They can have an IEP and not need supplementary aids and services, although I admit it's rare. But we've got to be careful that kids are always receiving their specially designed instruction. Otherwise, why do they have an IEP? And otherwise, how do we expect them to be able to achieve at the same level as their peers? Now, Here we go, specially designed instruction. I'll catch my breath for just a second and just double check, Megan, if there are any questions out there.
Yeah, so you might answer this in just a second, but we have a question from Catherine. If the student needs an adaptation and the teacher does it for the whole class, is that SDI?
Ooh, that is a very fair question, and I will have that one responded. I will have that one addressed in just about a minute or two. So let's jump right in and talk about what SDI is. First, it's tailored to the student's present level of performance. I know some of you say PLAF and all kinds of other things, but present level, as we all know. It's interesting, though, because SDI really should address two things. It should be getting at IEP goals, even though it doesn't show up in the IEP, with just a couple of states that are exceptions to that. But it also may address characteristics of a learner that may not be well captured in an IEP goal. For example, teachers will often tell me that they have students where they teach something one day and by the next day the kids have forgotten it. That's sort of tough to put into an IEP goal. Well, I would expect that in a co-taught class, that would be addressed very directly for the student. And if somebody looked deeply enough into a psych report, they'd probably find that that is outlined, that that is a characteristic of this learner. So that what we would expect in co-teaching is that we would have changed teaching techniques because the student has some kind of a memory issue. It could be that the student does fewer examples and works with a teacher to do them out loud, gets practice that is spaced out over time because that's a better way to help kids retain information. We may use something called backward chaining for that student so that the student sees more correct examples and then parts dropped off as the student is learning so that the kid gradually adds more of his or her own input on whatever's being taught. This is special ed world. We know that students who have IEPs need different sorts of teaching techniques. That's just one little teeny tiny example of addressing a memory issue by changing how the student is taught in that general ed classroom. We could go on that one for a long time, but I must move us along. Second, it's changes in content, methodology, or delivery. Those are not my words. Those words are widely written. It's very common that what we have to do is have students learn using direct, explicit instruction. This can be especially important in today's school environment where there's a lot of inquiry learning, a lot of problem-based learning. It's not that we shouldn't want students with IEPs to learn those techniques. The dilemma is somebody has to explicitly teach the students how to use those approaches to their learning. So that sometimes I see in classrooms, part of the class is receiving direct instruction, step-by-step, clear bridges, a lot of scaffolding, while other students have primary sources and they're doing a more exploratory method. It's really a hallmark of a mature co-taught class that the teachers can look at their students' needs, say, we could address this. We could literally use different teaching techniques, and that would address student needs. Very strong. But notice, if we have some students learning in a problem-based model, there may be students with IEPs there. They may not need the direct explicit. We may also have students who don't have IEPs, who do need it. There are a lot of students now who are very anxious about their learning. Perhaps co-teachers, you decide to put that student in the direct explicit group so that the student can focus on learning and be less concerned about performance and being good enough at whatever the project happens to be. This one, if you're a teacher educator, is a lot of thinking about what that means in a co-taught class. Next, it is systematic, it is planned, and it is monitored. I've been telling the story that I had an incident that happened in a large school district where an advocate came to a meeting with a parent and said, gee, this student has co-teaching in math. What is occurring in that class that constitutes this student's specially designed instruction? And sadly, nobody on the team had an answer. I don't think it's that nothing was going on, but there was virtually no documentation. It wasn't noted in the plans. were not data that demonstrated what had happened. There was no kind of decision-making trail that let everybody know what was going on. This point should start to help you understand that specially designed instruction is really not for every single student in class. What I usually tell people is this: if the two teachers decide that every student in class would benefit from, say, a learning strategy, we'll get to those momentarily, that's great. Teach it to everybody. But that is JGT, just good teaching. It may be specially designed instruction if, for the student with IEP or several students with IEPs, we have scaffolds, more practice, more repetition of it, more frequent review of it, and very careful attention to how the student applies the concept in other settings. In other words, some things that are just JGT become specially designed because we change how the student is learning whatever it happens to be. But if teachers say this, teachers, I know you do sometimes, we do everything for everybody. The dilemma with saying that is, then if I was an advocate, I'd be asking the question, then how come this student has an IEP? And it could be that the student doesn't have IEP services in that domain. Maybe the student doesn't need co-teaching in that particular subject area. But we've got to be very careful about that the student has an IEP for a reason. And if nothing is needed for that student that constitutes specially designed instruction, then the question comes up about why. Now, the rest of this is easy. The goal is curriculum access. We know that. We know that most students, something like 8.2 out of 10, should achieve at the same level as their peers, and in most districts they don't. And so one of the questions is, why not? And common answer now is, well, it's got to be a combination of where they're taught, which is why the push to get them every kid where it's appropriate into a general ed setting and not to have this simple fallback of separate setting. And the other half of it is how they're taught. And that's the whole conversation about specially designed instruction. And last piece, you know that there's specially designed instruction if it requires SET, special ed teacher skills. And that's one of the pieces that we have to work on. Spend a fair amount of time right now working with special ed teachers, helping them to get comfortable in their own special ed skin. And it's really important that they do that. I think we have to look, I'll come back to that in just a second. We have to realize that SDI is in all of these different areas. And it's academic as a primary concern because everybody's worried about kids' achievement. But it's just as important that we're looking at organizational, behavioral, social, emotional, all those other areas. I don't need to read them to you. And that any of those are appropriate areas for special educators to be intervening in a general ed classroom. SDI sometimes is a package. In many ways, that's the simplest, but those are the situations where it's least likely to go on in a co-taught class. Because when students are doing like highly specialized reading programs, Wilson, for example, that most often requires being in a separate setting. Probably the most common kind of specially designed instruction we need in co-taught classes are the instructional techniques or strategies like learning strategies. And being in lots and lots of classrooms across many, many grade levels and in urban, suburban, and rural areas, I sometimes am very, very concerned that we simply don't see instructional techniques and strategies as a standard part of co-taught classes. A third piece, integrated practices. For example, pauses during instruction, not just because that's good teaching, it's because we have two students in the class who have language processing issues, and pauses are built in so that students can catch up literally in their thought process. Telegraphic directions, likewise, when students have language issues, they need directions given very, very succinctly. And a special educator should have the responsibility of being sure that that happens for kids, possibly with the accommodation of visual cues. The other part of SDI, another big category of example, is the increased instructional intensity. More practice, more steps, more review, more careful data collection to determine whether or not the student is reaching whatever the instructional goal happens to be. Now, I'm just sketching this afternoon. Those are just like general ideas of what should be involved in this. The bottom line is SDI must be driven by student needs. And we say that, and yet sometimes when I see students doing things that everybody's doing, and they do that mostly, then I have to stop and ask, how is this student's particular needs being addressed through this class? Administrators, I think it's very fair to say to co-teachers, what specially designed instruction for these students with disabilities is part of this lesson. Occasionally the answer may be nothing in particular today, just those kind of general practice and giving kids more thought time and giving kids more opportunities to interact with each other. But there should be some kind of intentionality to the instruction that is SDI so that students are receiving what they need. Ultimately, SDI is how special educators think. A couple of years ago, I was in a middle school and we had been talking about this, and a special ed teacher burst into tears and ran from the classroom. I thought, that was cool. Marilyn, good thing to do, have people cry. She came back and she said, I've been a special ed teacher for 5 years, and today was the first day anybody talked explicitly about what I know that other people don't know and how I can put that into the classrooms where I teach. That's the message. We want loud and proud special educators who don't walk into classrooms saying, what would you like me to do? They walk into general ed classrooms saying, I'm here, I've got a job to do. Let's negotiate so we can both be successful with the kids. Now, I promised a few examples. I have to move along here. So I'll do these fairly quickly. You've got print materials and hopefully you can look at them in more detail. But here is sort of what I'm thinking about when we talk about SDI, learning strategies. I put RAP in because it's really simple. It can be done with very young children as well as with older kids. There are versions of this, if you go looking in the literature, that span almost the entire range of K through 12. Notice SDI has a research citation with it. One way that we know it's specially designed instruction is that it has a research base of some sort. Of course, Deschler is very well known in the world of strategy instruction. This is the kind of thing that we want to be sure that we have special ed teachers teaching children in classrooms. Example, say we're in intermediate grades. We teach the RAP strategy. It's introduced, it's practiced, kids memorize the acronym. We're not just saying every time a child has a paragraph to read, remember, what are you going to do first? Remember this, remember this. Asking comprehension questions. Our goal is to help that learner become independent and not need us to provide all the scaffolds. That's what learning strategies do. Cycling back to the question about, do we do them for everybody? Well, there's something called incidental benefit. If a student in a general ed class who doesn't have an IEP needs a strategy being taught, of course we provide it. But when strategies are delivered for every student, especially as kids get older, it really can be interfering with students' ability to develop their own ways of going about their learning tasks. Learning strategies are so important for students with IEPs because they often don't develop those strategies on their own. So RAP is just one example. You have a reference list at the back of your materials, and you can find some more pieces about learning strategies and other things in there. I also gave you an article from Teaching Exceptional Children. That's the QR code to the article, and that will give you a brief summary of it in case teachers, if you need it and it's not something that you've done before, or administrators, if you're looking for resources to share with your teachers. I have to keep rolling. Now, self-regulation, another huge, I'm trying to do the big ones, huge area for special education. 3 major components: teaching students to self-monitor, to self-evaluate, and then to self-instruct. It is used most commonly, and where it has received the most attention is with writing instruction, a la Steve Graham. There is an example on the right over here of a writing strategy, Powtree. You can see it's all spelled out there. I don't need to read it to you. We teach the strategy, we memorize it, then we teach students to monitor, are they using it? Self-evaluation, am I doing it correctly? Am I doing it consistently? Self-instruction, how do I talk myself through using the steps based on my self-evaluation? The whole notion of self-regulation is very critical. It's a way to help students take ownership for their learning, but not in a soft way. There is a set of steps to follow. There are strategies to be employed. In your reference list, I gave you Robert Reed's strategy instruction book, and there's a lot in there on self-regulation. If you do some web searching, you'll also find that it's very easy to find references for that. And there's one reference for you that's QR coded on self-regulated strategy development. Remember, I'm doing examples of specially designed instruction. Generalization is a big one. We all know that kids with IEPs, one characteristic of many of them is that they don't generalize. They don't learn a skill beyond the setting and the situation in which they first learned it. And one of the challenges all special educators face is getting kids to generalize what they've learned to other applications. That's another hallmark of many students who have disabilities. So we want to teach kids generalization. They need to learn it to use the same thing across people. For example, a student with autism learning to make eye contact and appropriately greet adults and classmates. It may be across settings that we teach a strategy in English for one student, but we need the student to use it in social studies, or it could be across behaviors, that is pausing in conversation for other students to participate and then being able to do that with people in settings. A lot to generalization. Again, I'm trying to fly through this. Margolis had an interesting article last fall on teaching generalization, and so I gave you a QR code on that one as well, hopefully to give you some more. Last one I can do this afternoon is behavior contracts. And I'm surprised at how people don't use behavior contracts with some kids. They're not the answer for everything, but kind of old-fashioned, classic Lloyd behavior contracts for some students really could make a difference on academic behavior or social behavior or misbehavior in a general ed classroom. And special educators should be experts at doing this. And if they don't know all of these items that are listed, that's where administrators, you've got to do some coaching of your special ed staff. Help them access resources. Behavior Advisor is a great website where they can find things. Look at any of the other behavior-based sites, the RTI sites. You'll find a lot of things in there. The goal is helping make sure that we are addressing students' needs, including their behaviors. Now, I have a video clip just briefly to kind of finish this kind of section. And what I'd like you to do as you listen, it's just a minute and a half. Listen to these two middle school teachers talk about their work with kids. I wish I could show you all 22 minutes I have of them talking as they talk about different techniques with different students. But think about how they talk SDI and accommodations and how they build what they're doing with this particular student. Here we go.
So one of the things that we use for G is we put this on all of her assessments, her summative assessments, and it's a reading strategies checklist that we're using as part of. She has an IEP goal that's working on those strategies and utilizing them independently. So we're trying to get her to utilize this independently. So this checklist is helpful for that. Working with Chi, because this isn't something that I can just put on a test and she knows what to do. Typically all the kids would do is just check everything that's there. So just kind of working with her on the different strategies that we talk about in class. We have a reading specialist who comes in once a week and she gives them strategies. So she talks about, reading all the passages. So then I would introduce that to her. So this is the end checklist that she has worked up to at the end of this year. But when we very first started with this, it was one or two things that were very simple for her to understand understand, like reading the directions or asking for help. And that's what we started with. And once we saw that she was mastering that, then we add on another strategy. Most of those are coming, I think, from the instruction of us teaching the different strategies and then relying on her to use them and to monitor those herself.
And the way this marriage works so well is now that she has this and you have the high interest stories, given the oral comprehension skills that she has in particular, she's picking this stuff up. It's just that decoding. So when she takes the time to do this right, after Miss Wissington has taught her how to use it, it really, really, you can see the difference when she's done reading the passage.
Now, I know that was brief. I hope you heard the accommodation is the sheet. The SDI is teaching her. Notice too, cycle back to the thing about if we use it with everybody, is it SDI? No, but the special ed teacher in this case goes back and teaches in more depth, more detail, scaffolds it for the student. That's what we want to see. And these two teachers can talk all day long intentionally about what they're doing for different students. If you need more examples, the What Worked Clearinghouse is your best bet. The practice guides are great. And of course, any special ed methods book, all of those places are more SDI. I have to move on. Megan, should I stop?
I was just going to say, before we get to mistake number 2, I have 2 quick questions. What's the difference between changes in content and modifications?
Okay, changes in content that would say that we do not change the standard, but we're adjusting what content we use in order to reach that standard. I'll tell you one really quick example for older kids is that kids read Shakespeare, but for some students with IEPs, the Shakespearean language is very, very difficult. So they might be reading from No Fear Shakespeare, this traditional English version. So we're changing the content of it, but in terms of understanding the themes behind Shakespeare and why we read Shakespeare, we're not changing the standard, we're changing the content that they're addressing. I hope that helps a little bit.
Okay, and then one more quick question. We're talking about examples of SDI. What would be an example in the technology or technological category?
Oh, I would tell you that. My favorite is teaching middle school kids who have phones how to use their phone as a learning tool. It's not adaptive technology, it's instructional technology. And, many kids take pictures of their assignments, but what about teaching them how to set alarms, how to get an app that really will help them organize what they're doing? That would be a very quick example that would apply to lots and lots and lots of students, and that would really help many of them. Shall I move on? Let's go to mistake. Let's do mistake number 2, because I'm going to have to, again, do brief examples for you. As you can tell, I'm passionate about the topic. We could spend the next 3 hours on it. You've seen this. We've been talking about what this is. Now we're going to blend these 2 parts. Here we go. It's our new day for co-teaching. This is where you have to know the 6 approaches. I am going to thrill everybody and not talk about them, presuming that you know what they are. The 3 we emphasize in particular for SDI are station teaching, parallel teaching, and alternative teaching. Those are the only ones I'll address this evening. Here are some examples for you. I have 4 to share with you. Alternative teaching. I just saw this. It was so cool. I couldn't stand it. It's in geometry, so we're in high school. The topic is properties of quadrilaterals. Most students are doing a review. They've just started the topic. They're only a couple days in. But at the back of the room, there's a small group using, see my little picture over here? That's a picture of what they were using. They're plastic strips that can snap together. They are physically manipulating them to look at the impact on angles and adjacent sides and opposite sides and all those other things. And they're making foldables as they go so that they're getting the vocabulary. They're having hands-on. Very important, they included a couple of kids who are very popular in that back group. That made it very okay. When the kids came back, the students who had the foldables, these were little. They were the size of an 3x5 index card, and they could just kind of look at their little cheat sheet. They're participating in the discussion. It's very clear they understood it. Very, very definite SDI through alternative teaching, because there was no way that the other kids needed or would have used the materials or the specificity of the instruction. Here's another example. Basic station teaching. All right, it's reading. Now we're doing younger children. It's comprehension, prefixes, and suffixes. Station number 1, the general ed teacher is doing the mini lesson. Those of you who are using any kind of workshop models, a lot of people get told the mini lesson has to be whole group. That's not really true. The mini lesson should be taught to every student in the class. Stations are often a way to do the mini lesson and make 100% sure that all the students understood it. The special educator is working with students, GET, SET, is working with students on root words and prefixes and suffixes. That's for 2 of the groups. But when one group comes through that needs more basic work, the special ed teacher is working on fluency and comprehension. Now, if you're talking younger grades, maybe the special ed teacher is doing supplemental phonics work when kids with IEPs come through. In other words, the special ed teacher in this particular example is going to adjust what's happening. Doesn't always have to be that crisp a difference. I'm just trying to illustrate with clear examples. Sometimes it'll be more through practice, and then it won't be as obvious that it's different work. Third station, kids are reading independently, and they have books at an instructional level, very common in elementary classrooms. The kids rotate through all 3 stations, and that's SDI. Now, this one is different, and I don't have it with a subject or a topic because it can be used at all levels. And you have a picture of this one because people have to get the hang of it, but it's marvelous. Start over here with the kids who are the higher achievers who really understand the material. In this station teaching, they're going to start in an independent station, whether it's writing, whether it's reading, whether it's trying the math problems without teacher assistance, whatever. Then I'm going to stick with these proficient learners. The second rotation, they are going to go to the general ed teacher and get whatever today's core is. It could be that the gen ed teacher will take what they've been working on, look at it, go over errors with them, push them, give some enrichment, because yes, all kids get a better education in a co-taught class. Then that group of learners will go back to the independent station, either to continue their work or perhaps with a different assignment. Now, the students who are kind of in the middle, notice in this model, kids have been grouped based on a specific skill assessment. The kids who are average are starting with the special educator. Maybe it's word work of some sort. Maybe it's reviewing concepts that they haven't gone over for a while. Maybe it's addressing standards that some students missed on a unit assessment, whatever it happens to be. This group of kids then goes to the independent station where perhaps they work on their writing or they have a reading assignment, whatever it happens to be. They finish with the general ed teacher and that person makes sure that they've gotten their core instruction for the day. Now, here's where it gets really cool. The struggling learners, so those who are having a difficult time, they start with the general ed teacher, core instruction, whatever the bare bones version is, what we have to get to. But then look at what happens for rotation 2 and 3. The struggling learners stay with the special educator. That lets that person give them more practice, more detail, go over IEP topics. Special ed teachers, you often say to me, there's not enough time to get at all the IEP work. Well, this is a station teaching model that certainly lets you do that. So keep this one in mind. If co-teaching is new for you teachers or administrators, if it's brand new in your schools, this is not really a starting point. But more and more, the co-teachers who have some experience are learning the point that this model makes. And that is the 6 fundamental approaches are not the end. There are infinite varieties, variations, combinations, and nearly all of them make the delivery of SDI easier in the co-taught class. By the way, this is just one version of this. There are other ways that people do it. If you put your heads to it, administrators get your teachers to work on it. There are lots of other options. All right, got to keep moving here. Parallel teaching. Here's an example that goes back to what I was talking about before. It's in science, and the topic is the water in our rivers clean enough to make it safe for activities such as tubing? Now, I don't know, maybe you live where tubing is not the right topic, but had to throw in something that sounded interesting. It's a question, and part of the kids are going to work with the general ed teacher. They will have primary sources about water quality, water safety, looking at all those critical topics related to safe water. There are key questions they're answering, and the general ed teacher is really there primarily as a guide. On the other hand, the special ed teacher is going to work with the other half of the kids, and remember, that doesn't mean just students with IEPs. For either teacher, they're going to be directly guided. Probably start with a conversation about what makes water safe, review concepts about pollution and what kinds of pollution are in our area, go back and maybe relook at a video that we've seen. The goal of the work is identical, but the teachers are going to get there using different teaching approaches. Remember, no example I'm giving is the right answer for everything. These are illustrations of what creative co-teachers are doing so that they are able to reach all of their learners, and all of them have at least some place in the co-teaching process. Ready? Megan, shall I ask? Do we have any questions?
No, let's go on to number 3.
All right. Here's the trick to this. For specially designed instruction to be integrated into a co-taught class, we have to have this approach to it. I'm always looking for ways to break the rules and do things differently. That's the key to my success. And the more everybody experiments, the more people use those 3 approaches primarily, with small amounts of data collection through One Teach, One Observe, of teaming only when there is a purpose for it, as when teachers will argue different points of view or model biography by interviewing each other. When teachers have a specific reason, they team, and then bringing that One Teach, One Assist down to as little as possible. When I'm face-to-face with people, I usually say 10% or less would make me very happy, because I'm never quite certain how we equate that with really helping students grow as learners. And probably special ed teachers, you know this, there's such a huge likelihood that it will teach kids to be dependent, and that is just something that we can't do to students. It's not fair to them. And the high school people who are on, they know that, because when kids get to high school, they're at such a disadvantage if we haven't taught them how to think for themselves and how to implement strategies to help themselves be successful learners. All right, third one, we lack evidence to demonstrate the implementation of SDI and its effectiveness. Now we're going to put all 3 pieces together. We've focused on this. It's embedded in the approaches, but in order to have our data and our documentation, it often comes back to this. And we have to be sure that the professionals understand their responsibilities. For example, first thing we have to do is talk about how they plan. When teachers are planning for co-teaching, there needs to be in their planning a discussion of IEP goals. My message, teachers, is this: you don't plan instruction without IEP goals on the table or up on your computer. Because if we're not keeping the goals in front of us, we tend to lose track of them. If your thinking is, yeah, but Marilyn, a lot of the goals, they're written and we only cover them in like 2 weeks and then they're not relevant anymore. Or our IEPs cut across school years, and so sometimes the IEP goals really related to last year, but we don't even do those things in this class this year. Now, that tells me we've got to have a conversation. Administrators, this one's for you, about what's being put in IEPs, and really thinking carefully about the ramifications of what the IEP goals say and what that implies and what message it gives to special educators for how to carry out the SDI. So we've got to be very careful of that. This says macro planning. Those of you who know me know that I advocate not trying to schedule common planning every day or every week. If you have it, it's not that it's bad. It's just that teachers get so caught up in planning that they don't get other work done, and it ends up making more work for themselves. I usually talk about planning every 3 to 4 weeks. And if people have that much planning, we macro plan so we know what's coming. And then we switch our planning to the cloud. General ed should plan the daily general ed lesson. Special ed teachers should plan SCI and should annotate the general ed lesson plan. This is a heart and soul issue. I find right now that people want to spend a lot of time talking to each other planning. A lot of that becomes general planning. The special ed planning doesn't happen. And it's really not good for kids with IEPs. Or what happens is special ed teachers will say, we just use the general lesson plan, and that's what we base our teaching on. I'm sympathetic to the dilemmas and the complexities of this, but wow, if you do lesson plans, if you were in a separate setting, you'd probably have one. And I'm not talking about anything that's arduous. I'm talking about annotations, about strategies we're implementing, techniques that are used consistently with kids. Part of my very firm belief about how to make this work in real schools every day is to make sure we understand that responsibility should be divided. General ed should do the general ed part, which is that daily lesson planning. Special ed has got to do the special ed part, which is the intentional, data-driven, specially designed instruction, and then blending that into that general lesson plan. Next piece, role reciprocity. We used to worry a lot about whether special ed teachers knew the content enough. Now it's a little bit different, because what we have to say is, yeah, I know special ed teachers have to be at least comfortable enough or conversant enough that they can participate in a classroom, but they have an obligation to be sure the general ed teacher is conversant enough in the specially designed instruction being implemented that they can help with its delivery and or its practice. Special ed teachers are the accountable party to design it and work on implementation, but gen ed needs to come along. In some ways, this is a very healthy sort of thing. Neither teacher should expect to become the other teacher. They help each other out, but they each hold their own areas of expertise. And then the last piece about planning is that data discussion and data collection plans have to be a part of this as well. Now, to do all of this, sometimes you get a brainstorm and sometimes you only get the clouds. What happens is that planning moves largely to the cloud. And that has to be just standard practice, administrators. If you want this to become sustainable, if you can find the co-taught planning time weekly, more power to you. The dilemma is, as co-teaching grows and as more people are involved, it gets very difficult. Elementary teachers are working with 2 or 3 grade levels or more sometimes. In large high schools, people are working all over the school. How much of that shared time is possible? So we plan in the cloud. This is just one example, and anybody who's interested in this, I brought up Google because everybody plans in Google now. This can be created. You can go out and find this, get on Pinterest, and notice it's just, I'm not trying to tell people how specifically to lesson plan. That's not my job. But notice there's a place on here to mention specially designed instruction. There's a place to indicate what co-teaching structure will be used. Those are the tools that can make this efficient and effective, and that with a little bit of correspondence in the cloud can make planning not that hard. And then we have our documentation. The other one I'll just mention is planbook.com, and I mention it because a lot of people like it. If you've never seen it, you should go out and play. This is the front page of their website. Lots and lots and lots of ideas from them. By the way, that one can also, I had to go back. Planbook.com lets people share. So co-teachers can access each other's lesson during the co-taught time of the day, not the whole day necessarily, so that they can make it viewable and editable by their partner. And then all of a sudden we can really do some very cool planning in the cloud. Now, I did this as a group too because I knew I'd be toward the end of my time. There are so many data collection apps out there. I was just in Wyoming working with a group out there, and we spent, I think a couple of hours playing with apps and other options. Some are for classroom use where you end up with data like Backchannel, Quizalize, Quizzes. Others, Kahoot, Nearpod. Some of these though really are for data collection, that we can keep over time, like Google Sheets, Super Duper Data Tracker. My message to everybody is this: in a school, in most cases, special educators should kind of agree on a few data collection apps they will use or sites they will use, and get comfortable and consistent on a small number. I'm talking like 2, maybe. Not the classroom things so much. I have those in there just because they're great and they give you your data as you go. But so that there's something consistent, so that one person is working with a student, they're using the same system as another person working with that student. Then, as people get comfortable, grow from there. I'm absolutely stunned when people are not using the data collection tools that are now available easily. And so that's mostly a list so that you know they're out there. Google Forms, that's a fine way to gather data. No problem doing that. How about Google Sheets? And this is something I just pulled it off a web, off of a Google site. And these are, because it's all out there. If you don't have any ideas, if you just type in searches, you'll see that there are all kinds of examples. You can use the templates, and then all you have to do is tailor them for your own situation. Tech people can help out a lot on this. And my other recommendation when people are trying to figure some of these things out is to ask any 12-year-old, because they can certainly tell you how to do this. Now, I've been kind of rushing along because I see that we are just now coming up on 5 o'clock, and I promised that we would try to have time for some questions. I want to point out to you that in your materials for this, if you download the print handouts, you don't have all of my pictures, but you have all of the content slides. And I did give you a quick checklist that is sort of a summary of what we've been talking about today. You know, how do I know it's specially designed instruction? I hate to say it, but in a few places now, people will say, does this count? Does this count? And it's not really about counting. It's looking at how well it matches student need, how data-driven it is, how evidence-based, research-based, and making sure that it's tailored to the needs of the student within the context of general ed. But hopefully this will help you out just a little bit on that. Let me see if there are other questions. Megan, what do we have?
Okay, how do you recommend co-teachers work out the logistics of actually implementing the approaches, especially those higher preparation approaches like station, beyond annotation, and document?
Yeah, I'll tell you what I see works best. And sometime when someone shows me in a workshop, I'm going to make them take a screenshot and send it to me. People are doing this in the cloud. So the general ed teacher will post a lesson plan and say, I'm thinking stations, I'll do this, you do this, here's the independent, what do you think? And the special ed teacher will annotate that, especially if they're in a Google, in the cloud option, and will say, okay, but for this group of kids, I need to go back and work on phonics, and I've got my set of skills we're working on. In other words, they do that in the cloud. Hard part is when partnerships are brand new, they want a lot of time to talk to each other. My advice to administrators is give people a chunk of time right before their contract begins so that they can talk, map out September or whatever, August if you start early, and have a few of these ideas in place. When they plan face-to-face, and remember I did say they need that periodically, what I usually recommend is that they talk about patterns for their co-teaching. Oh, we're going to do a lot of writing. Chances are we're going to want a lot of stations. Oh, this is one where we've got some students who are way behind. They don't understand I'll go little kids again, beginning, middle, and end. Let's plan on doing an alternative group twice this week to get them caught up. In other words, if they sketch out a pattern, if they sketch out the big pieces, then the cloud part works. I actually, and I think I said this, I don't recommend that brand new co-teachers do that really complicated one that I talked about. What people are finding is that setting up simple stations, basic alternative, or I'll mention this, double alternative, where both teachers are pulling small groups, and also doing parallel teaching, once they get their heads around what the purpose of this is, it's not quite as big as it feels when it's new. Not unusual for people to say, oh my word, do you know how much time all this would take us? If people start thinking about gen ed do the general plan, special ed do the special plan, then we'll put the two together and front load planning at the start of the school year. I think you'll find it works pretty well. I'm in a lot of places that are using these approaches, and the best thing is their data on their student outcomes are spectacular. There's a high school district I work with in Illinois just for kicks. And last year, with really good co-teaching and a lot of SDI, they've been really working at it. In math, the co-taught sections, and this was for kids with and without disabilities, outperformed solo taught sections of the same course by, on average, 20 percentage points. You got to admit, those are some pretty good results from all of this. All right, Megan, what else do we have? Sorry.
Okay. How do we respond to the request of principals wanting more teacher positions to co-teach when this doesn't necessarily align with the needs of the students with disabilities? If we don't have the resources to do co-teaching, where should we start trying to meet this demand and supporting our principals?
Well, I think we have to have a conversation about how much co-teaching is needed. There's a tendency in some places to overserve students with IEPs. And it's hard to know. This one has so much location impact. Like if you're talking the New York area, co-teaching may be all day. And then people will say, we just can't do it. We don't have the resources. You know, what I tend to say is, unless caseloads are ridiculous, I guess I call ridiculous like 25 or 30 at the elementary level. And there are places, if you're gasping, know that that is not unheard of. If caseloads are 15-ish, 20-ish, then what we may need to say is, let's take a look at what we're doing. If our caseloads are really high, then we may need to say, where's the best place to focus our co-teaching effort? You know, I think it's a crime not to have co-teaching for students who need it, but we may need to say, in kindergarten and first grade, they need intensive reading instruction with a package, like, you know, one of the prepackaged reading programs. So we're going to pull kindergarten and first graders. We're also going to cross grade levels for small groups. Then we'll start looking at where we co-teach. In high school, the first choices are usually English 9 and algebra, because those are two absolutely critical classes for getting kids successfully through a high school program. You know, I almost need to sit down knowing a lot more information, but I would tell you that oftentimes the immediate reaction is I've had many meetings where what we realized is that it's not about more staff, it's about realistically determining how much special ed service students need, something called mapping, hand scheduling students so that we cluster groups of kids and get them in the right place, judiciously assigning the special ed teachers, and keeping a small amount of pull-out service where it's appropriate for the students.
Okay, now we have a question from Mary on kind of that same topic. If a special ed teacher is assigned to provide services to students across 3 separate classrooms in the same instructional block, and they're either pushed in or they pull students out, is that considered a co-taught classroom, especially if the SPED teacher's pushed in?
Well, when we start saying 3 different places during one instructional period, if we're talking elementary and it's 90 minutes and it's 30, that can still be a co-taught class. I don't use the term push in at all. I don't even know really what it means. And I know in some states that term is used where it's not real co-teaching. But I guess my view is, if you're going to put 2 professionals in the classroom, why would you want the special educator to just go grab the kids with IEPs and kind of go over to the corner? That sounds to me like resource room in the corner of the classroom. So I tend to say co-teaching if we're there. 30 minutes in elementary is kind of the minimum length of time, but it can be done. Sometimes in elementary, we move students across classrooms at the same grade level, because then we can spend more time and focus our efforts for skill instruction, and that has to be worked out at a school level, but it's very commonly done. If we're talking at the upper grade levels, if we're in block schedule, half blocks work, then we negotiate who gets the special ed teacher in the classroom during which part of the class, and that has to be variable, and the teachers have to talk about it. 3 different places in the upper grade levels in one block. My guess is that it's more likely to be a consulting model, and I just want to have a conversation about what's being accomplished by doing that. You know, if the answer is, well, that's the way the minutes are written on the IEP, then we have to have a whole different conversation. Co-teaching ripples and ripples and ripples, and we have to make sure that we're getting all the moving parts in place. So it's hard to give you a better answer than that. I'm sorry that I can't do better, but I got to know a lot more detail. I hope that helps a little bit.
Okay, I think that's it for now. You guys can still type your questions in the box, and I know Marilyn's got a couple more slides, and we're right over our 5 o'clock time limit, so I'll let her start.
Yes, I knew we had just a couple. We could go over just shortly, just briefly. Please, if you're a teacher, if you're a site administrator, if you're a special ed director, if you're a teacher, educator, a consultant working with people in schools, this is the topic right now for co-teaching. Co-teaching has been justifiably criticized as being lacking in the delivery of SDI. I actually think that's fair. We spent a long time worrying so much about getting 2 teachers into a classroom that there was almost an assumption that once they were there, students would get what they needed. We've moved way past that at this point, and a number of people across the country are working on this topic. Anytime we go into a co-taught class, the question is, where's the SDI? The companion question is, are we getting 2 salaries worth of teaching from this classroom with 2 teachers in it? That sounds a little harsh, but it's really where we have to be. And if we all work at it, I'm optimistic. I wouldn't do this if I thought it was not possible. I see jaw-droppingly good teaching, and I see students who are surpassing anybody's expectations and who are very happy in school. What more could we ask for the students with IEPs? You've got a reference list. I hope you will use some of the things that are on it. It's certainly not comprehensive. It was what I could fit on one slide. Please go back and be the voice and not the echo on this topic. Special educators, if you're viewing without your administrators, you might want to just have a little chat with them over the next several days, because this is something that really does take the collaboration. That's the professional role part, and really does take a conversation. I want to thank everybody. I know everybody works as hard as they can. I don't meet teachers or administrators who are in education for the fame or the glory. I know that everyone has kids' best interests at heart. I know that everybody is doing what they think is the best. Sometimes it's hard because, well, for some people, the cheese moved, and we have to help people move over to the cheese. But I thank you. I wish you the best. You have my email on the very first slide, and if there's a question that came up, or if you're encountering something unique to your district or your school, I'm happy to correspond. Please just be patient, because I get a lot of email. Thanks, everybody. It's been a pleasure, even though I couldn't see you or hear you.
Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, Marilyn. So just as a reminder for all of you with us on the webinar, you will get an email later tonight or tomorrow morning with information on accessing the recording and the presentation slides, as well as a link to evaluate the webinar and request professional development hours. And just a reminder for my groups, everyone who's watching live can request that PDH. You'll just have to have the person who registered send you that link. Thank you so much, everyone. We appreciate you taking the time to join us tonight. Thanks again to Marilyn, and I hope everyone has a wonderful evening.